Hi, everybody. I can't see you all, but I'm going to assume you're out there listening and watching, either live or you may be catching this later. I'm Madeline McIntosh. I am the publisher of Authors Equity, which is a small book publisher based here in New York. And I have the great pleasure today of speaking with these two gentlemen. Let me introduce first JL because he is our author. Here at Authors Equity, JL is the author of The Simple Path to Wealth. He originally published it 10 years ago. It has sold over 1 million copies worldwide and been translated into many languages. I had the great pleasure of working with JL on the new edition, which we published last year. And now, a year later, it's still on the New York Times list. So that's a great accomplishment. And then, really exciting, JL just gave me a peek at a foreword that he is writing to the Simple Path to Wealth workbook, which is being written by Jessica Collins, who any longtime followers of JL will know that she is really the original inspiration for the Simple Path. And that book, The Simple Path to Wealth Workbook, is going to be available as a finished book this holiday period at the end of the year, but it is up and available for pre-order now if you're excited to go ahead and do that. And then this is a real thrill because it's my first chance to meet Morgan Housel. Morgan is the author of the wildly popular Psychology of Money. It has been a fixture on the New York Times list for I don't know how long now, a very long time. And of course, he is also the author of Same as Ever and most recently, The Art of Spending Money. These two books are really wonderful complements to each other. They are often when somebody is just either starting to try to get their arms around how to think about money and the role of money in their lives, either how to accumulate it or how to think about how to spend it. These two gentlemen are the ones who they often turn to. So it's a real honor to be able to get the two of you together. So welcome.
Thanks so much for
Thank you.
having us.
Yeah, it's an honor to be here, and it's great to reconnect with Morgan. I'm
Like
a big fan, so
Yeah,
I'm excited
absolutely.
too.
likewise, this is gonna be fun.
All right, so we have here a mix of questions coming from me and then a couple of others that people have registered and shared ahead of time. So let's start with my questions. And to start with, let's talk about generations. Because as a mother of two kids who are about to graduate from college, I think a lot about the how different generations think about money. And Morgan, can I maybe start with you in terms of what you've observed? So when you're speaking to all the different kind of audiences you do and you get feedback from readers, is there a fundamental difference in how people think about money, either as they're moving through their lives or just from a kind of Gen Z versus boomer perspective?
There's definitely generational differences, but I think more of the differences are visible when you dig into the differences within a single generation. I'll give you one example of this. It's often talked about, and there's been a lot of studies showing that people who grew up during the Great Depression, that stuck with them for life. You can measure how it impacted their relationship with debt and spending 30 years into the future. There's this very interesting anecdote, and it's a flagrant anecdote of JFK was giving a speech one time, and he said he didn't realize that the Great Depression took place until he read about it when he was in college, because his family, the Kennedy family, made more money in the early 1930s than they ever had in their life. They were buying up cheap real estate and whatnot. And so there's all these unique experiences within that. And it's too blanket to say the people who grew up during the Great Depression, because the range of outcomes within that ranged from people who did very well to catastrophic. And I think that's true in any generation. And we see that right now in the last 10 years. With the exception of like the last 12 months or so, if you worked in tech for the last 10 years, it's the greatest period you've ever known. You have made an absolute fortune. And there are like mid-level workers who are making deep six-figure incomes and have million-dollar stock grants and whatnot, it's been an absolute gold mine for you. If you worked in manufacturing over the last 10 years, or name a dozen other fields, construction, whatever it might be, it's been a very poor period. And there have been periods over the last 10 years that looked something close to the Great Depression. And I think this explains something that's happened, not to take this in a very different direction, but I think one of the issues with politics over the last 10 years is more than has been experienced at any time in probably the last 10 years or last 100 years, I'd say. You have half the country that looks at the other half and says, I don't understand why you think the way you do. I don't understand why you believe X, Y, and Z. And I think a lot of this is social media as well, which has made people more aware of the experiences of other people. And that has kind of freaked them out in the sense of like, I can't believe there are other people who have lived a life very different than I have. And so to answer your question, yes, there are generational experiences between boomers, Gen Z, millennials, going on down the list. But within that, you have a much wider range of outcomes that shapes how people think about money and risk and goals.
Mhm.
Yeah, to pick up on one of the last things that Morgan just said there, and I agree. I think this social media has really had a profound effect because people aren't looking at their situation historically. How am I doing compared to my parents, my grandparents, previous generations? They're looking online at how am I doing compared to these idealized versions they see of other people's lives. And what's striking to me is how wealthy the world has become in my lifetime. I mean, the amount of wealth today that I just see out in the world is stunning to me and far greater than when I came out of college, for instance. And I think when I think in terms of generations, when I started my journey, which was 50 years ago, 1975, there was very little information out there. I would have killed to have had a book like The Psychology of Money as an example, but it didn't exist. So I spent decades wandering in the wilderness. And I hear and talk to young people now, and some surprisingly young, some in their late teens, because every now and again I'll talk some professor friends of mine will invite me to talk to their class. And it's amazing to me how engaged and informed these young people are and the caliber of their questions they ask because they have this information at their fingertips and they're taking advantage of it. Now, to Morgan's point, that's well taken. That certainly doesn't apply to everybody today in every generation. There's lots of different outcomes within a generation. But if you're so inclined, the information that is available to you today and the amount of wealth that is simply out there to be tapped today is stunning. And I think the path to wealth is has never been clearer or easier for that reason.
But I think the interesting thing connected to that is going back to the beginning of your response, Morgan, that um, the wealth is on display. That doesn't mean everybody has access to it.
Yeah.
And so money is emotional. And so it does seeing the access to wealth that many people have also creates some anger and distancing then for some people.
Yeah.
Uh, the one of the one of the things that I really loved in Simple Path to Wealth is when you talk about um, one of the values of money is not really in thinking. You can think of it in terms of what does it allow you to buy,
Right.
or you can think of it in terms of what freedom does it allow you to buy. And that does strike me as something, not to overly harp on the generations, but that idea of freedom and independence feel like something that is resonates, but he has to resonate particularly with people coming into the workforce today who have there's a lot of risk out there, whether it is a war in the Middle East, whether it is the idea of AI replacing jobs, whatever it is. But I think part of the message that I know you convey is that you can, if you play your cards right, you can think of money as something that is going to protect you from having to worry about all those things. And I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, of kind of the emotional state that we bring to money and the importance of thinking of it as path to freedom as opposed to a path to stuff.
Yeah, so I think the first thing I'd say is there have always been risks out there. There are certainly risks out there today, but this moment in time is not particularly unique. The kinds of risks that we're facing are different, but there have always been risks. And one of the questions I get periodically is what motivated my views about money. Morgan talked about people who grew up in the Depression. I'm not quite that old, but one of the things, and it's not hard to understand my own psychology, when I was young, my dad was a pretty successful self-employed guy, and we had a pretty comfortable life. But he was a cigarette smoker. And the problem with cigarettes is they kill you slowly and they
Mhm.
debilitate you along the way. So as the disease progressed, my father's health declined. And as his health declined, his ability to earn declined. And because he was not a saver and investor, that's all we had. And so when that went away, we went from being very comfortable to being very uncomfortable. And there were not the kinds of safety nets around at that point. And that is clearly what drove my instinct to make sure as soon as I could that I wasn't solely dependent on my ability to earn to pay the bills. So one of the things I push back a lot on is people who say, well, this all sounds great, but it just feels like deprivation. I don't get to spend my money. I have to save it and invest it. And that just feels awful. And to me, it never felt like deprivation. It felt like I was buying the single most important thing I could think of with my money, which was security and freedom. And of course, you buy that by accumulating assets. But spending my money on the thing that was most important to me never felt like deprivation. It just felt like spending the money on the thing that was most important to me, and that felt great, and that provided immediate gratification. For me, there was none of this delayed gratification stuff. The building my assets and getting stronger and stronger financially was immediate gratification. Didn't feel at all like deprivation. So I think the way people think about it could use some shifting. And I'm also of the opinion that very, very few people are going to follow the simple path to wealth. They're going to follow the path to becoming financially independent. And when I come across people who first engage with it and for whom it resonates, there's a tremendous excitement. And one of the things that comes out of that is this idea that this is such a cool thing. This is such an obviously great way to live that, of course, everybody who hears about it is going to embrace it. But I don't think that's true at all. I think we are destined to be unicorns because too often when people hear about it, if you say to anybody, do you want to be wealthy? Yeah, of course, I want to be wealthy. Do you want to be financially independent? Absolutely. I want to be financially independent. Do you want to buy that before the big house? Do you want to buy that before the fancy car? Do you want to buy that before going out to the fancy restaurants every night? Well, no, I have to have those things.
Mhm.
So I think it's a matter of priorities. And I frequently say I would never presume to tell anybody how to spend their money. I can tell you that if you don't spend a significant amount of money on building your financial freedom, then you're probably not going to have your financial freedom. But that apparently is not nearly as important to most people as the other things they can spend their money
Um, uh, Morgan, since you've recently published The Art of Spending,
on.
I'm curious what kinds of conversations you've had with readers about on that topic.
The way that I've always thought about this, and this is very much aligned with, I think, what JL just said, is I've never really viewed it as saving money as much as I viewed it as purchasing independence. And I
Yeah,
viewed independence as something to be bought, something to be purchased along with a house and a car and clothes and vacations. And
yeah.
once you view it like that, then the sense of sacrificing for delayed gratification kind of goes away because I gain benefit and pleasure today, right now, from the savings that I've accumulated because it gives me independence today and right now. And then whether it is a headline of war or a personal thing in your career or your health, whatever it might be, the ability to have options over your future and not be completely beholden to other people's goals, other people's ideas, other people's risks and uncertainty. That is something that has given me more pleasure than any material good that I've purchased. Some people have a different desire for that and different propensity for that, but I think everybody at their core desires some form of independence. People have different desires for material possessions and vacations, whatnot. Those vary greatly. Everybody wants to be independent. Nobody wants to be beholden to other people's ideas and other people's risks. And so I think that shift in savings, when you shift it from saving money for X at this date in the future towards, I just want to wake up every morning with the knowledge that I can do whatever I want. I can work when I want. I can move when I want. I can retire when I want. That's more valuable than anything.
So obviously Morgan and I are on the same page in this, but
Yeah,
if I can ask Morgan a question, I'm curious
please.
as to what he hears, because I agree with everything you said, but most people don't choose to spend their money that way. And most people don't get that satisfaction. I don't think they even understand that it's available to them. But even when they become aware of it, in my experience, a lot of them just say, no, I'd rather buy the fancy car. And I'm wondering what your take on that is. Is your experience that when people learn that, oh, financial freedom and the autonomy that provides can give me immediate gratification building it, and it's an extraordinarily valuable thing to have, is it your experience most people then embrace it? Because that's not mine.
No, not in the slightest. I think a good analogy here is we now have a lot of information and wisdom and knowledge about proper nutrition, diet, and exercise. Does that mean that everyone goes out and does it? No, they eat Twinkies and sit and watch TV. And so I think it's the same with money. We have a lot of knowledge about the right ways to invest and how you should invest, how you should think about savings and saving for retirement. Does that mean everyone's going to do it? Absolutely not. There is a mild wide gap between knowing what you should do and having the psychology and the behaviors to actually go out and do it. And there's a lot of things in life that fill that idea. And I don't think that'll ever change. I think despite having as much information and knowledge as we do, 100 years from now, people will still be eating bad diets, not exercising enough, and not having good financial habits. And not just some people, but the majority of people. I think you're fighting against millions of years of human accumulated knowledge that pushes people towards competing with each other and doing it on a right now basis. And I think in a lot of ways, it's not only, I think it's unavoidable because for a lot of ways, life is a competition with other people for resources, jobs, attention, whatever it might be. And in that world, it doesn't necessarily matter how much money I make. What matters is that I make more than you. And now some people can push back against that. I think you and I have done it and want other people to do it. But that's very different from saying everybody will do it.
Yeah, well said. Well said.
I'm looking at some of the questions that have come in, and um, this we were talking a bit earlier about thinking about all this from the perspective of being parents. So this question is, what are some money advice or lessons that you would teach your kids? I mean, jail, that's what the simple path to wealth is all about. But so I think I might first turn this one to Morgan. Um, so this is interesting. How do you teach them to not be too frugal and to not overspend on things? So it's what I think is interesting about that question is that clearly there is an emotional angle to this, the idea of being too frugal. Jail might say there's no such thing as being too frugal. That's the answer. But as Morgan, as a parent, what are the just give us kind of like what are the main nuggets that you hope your kids will take on board?
I think there's good and bad news here. The good news is you don't need to teach them anything. The reason why is because they're already paying attention. They don't need a lecture. They are absorbing every single act that you do and that you say with money. And so the bad news, so to speak, maybe it's not bad news, is that the only thing you can do that's effective is lead by example. That's the only thing that's going to work. And whatever example that you lead with is what they're going to learn by. I think almost everybody has learned a tremendous amount about money from their parents. And it goes one of two ways. It's either you watched your parents make good financial decisions and you say, I want to do more of that and follow them. Or you watched your parents make very poor financial decisions and you say, I want to run away from that as fast as I can. And so there's always some learning. People learn in different elements and sometimes they learn in different directions. But I think the only thing you can do as a parent is lead by example. A lot of higher net worth families, when they're trying to say, how can I use my money to better my children without spoiling them, tend to get this wrong in an innocent way. They really mean well, but they will try to teach their kids through humiliation. And that's not their goal. That's not the intent. But the idea of, oh, we have a lot of money as our parents, but we're going to make our kids earn theirs and work for theirs, and we're not just going to give it to them. And a lot of times, I would say 9 times out of 10, the message that the child hears in that situation is not, I need to work hard and earn my own. The message that the child hears, particularly when they're young, is I'm not as good as mom and dad. I'm not as worthy as mom and dad. And rather than teaching your children grit and integrity, you kind of snowplow their self-esteem. And so I think that happens a lot. And that's why I like leading by example rather than lecture or certainly humiliation. And so I think a lot about with my kids who are still young, but all kids are paying attention. They're paying attention more than you know. That every time I say, we value this, we don't value that. We can't afford this, we can't afford that. We're talking about other people's money, our money. Every time you say something, they are building a mental model of how they think money works and what they expect in their own life.
You know,
Okay.
once again, I'm thinking I wish Morgan had been writing when I was younger and
I know.
my daughter
Yeah.
was younger. Where were you 30 years ago, Morgan? But I love this because basically what you're saying, the good news is you don't have to teach them anything because they're going to follow your example. And the bad news is they're going to follow your example, right?
Right.
So that actually dovetails very nicely with my experience raising Jessica. So I made the mistake of not only trying to teach, but pushing it way too hard, way too soon. And of course, that had the effect of turning her off to all things money, which is what made me start writing the letters to her that morphed into the blog, that morphed into the book, and the talk was. And she teases me now, and she says, Dad, if I'd listened to you when I was young, there'd be no blog, there'd be no books, Morgan wouldn't want to chat with you on a webinar. And so it's worked out pretty well. But my wife used to tell me, and she turned out to be correct, that because I was getting very concerned and very frustrated because I could see that it was all of my teaching efforts were hitting this blank wall. And Jane would say, she's absorbing more than you realize. And I used to say, if she's absorbing anything, it's more than I realize, because it just felt to me like there was nothing going on. But in retrospect, that was absolutely true. And so what my wife was saying was true, and it matches exactly what Morgan just said. She was paying attention and she was listening, and more importantly, she was watching how we lived our lives. And she tells me now when she went to college, she just assumed that's the way everybody did things.
Mm.
And then she wound up having friends. And when they start to talk about money, she realized that not everybody had this sound, healthy relationship with it that somehow she had developed. And maybe there was something unique going on. And of course, the good news at this point is that she's turning 34 next month, and she quit her corporate job about 18 months ago. She followed the simple path. She's financially independent and quit her corporate job. So, from my point of view, mission accomplished. But it was accomplished pretty much the way, again, I wish I'd had Morgan's advice back in the day.
Yeah.
It saved me a lot of time and grief, you know.
Um, what do you think about the fact that there are, um, this is everybody's exposed to this, but I imagine younger people are perhaps more influenced by it, is kind of the gamification of investing, and that there are like I remember my son's like middle school had there was an investment club and they weren't investing real money, but it was kind of like, developing the idea of picking stocks. And if the stories are all over the place about people in their teens and into their 20s, just, essentially getting kind of addicted to day trading. Um, I'm guessing neither one of you would advise that as something to have people doing, but what would you say to, like let's say there's a 16-year-old boy who says, Morgan, what stocks are you gonna stock tips are you gonna give me? Because I'm really into this stuff and I'm going to do a stock pick.
Yeah,
I think
What
there's
is
a
it
couple of
when
things.
you're
yeah,
encountering
Morgan,
that mentality?
give us some hot tips here.
Yeah, give us some stock tips. Yeah.
One thing I would say is whenever I do a session like this with high school students, every single time, without exception ever, a very smart 16-year-old raises their hand and says, what penny stock should I buy to double my money in the next week? And I think I have to remind myself that that is the natural intuition of even very smart young people is how do I get rich fast? How can I do it as quickly as possible? And it takes a lot of emphasis, even to very intelligent people, to be like, no, the fastest way to get rich is to do it slowly over time. That is not intuitive at all, which is why it's so rare, I think. And in terms of like the gamification of investing, I remember in 2009, I think it was, during the financial crisis and the market meltdown, Jon Stewart of The Daily Show had Jim Cramer on. And Jim Cramer at the time was in a lot of heat for some calls that he had made that didn't turn out right. And Jim Cramer said, I'm paraphrasing all this, but Jim Cramer was like, well, John, you got to understand, like, this is not just financial advice, it's entertainment. And we're trying to entertain people. And that's why we got all the lights and the buttons and whatnot. And John said, I understand you're trying to entertain people, but this is not a game with a very strong expletive in there too.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important point that the ability to fund your college or your children's college, the ability to retire, the ability to pay for your health care when you're older is not a game. It's a very important part of life. And so on one hand, you kind of sound like an old grumpy stooge by saying like, oh, this is not a game. You should do it. You should do this the right way, not not in Robin Hood. But I think there's a lot of truth to that, that if you teach young people, and most of the evidence is the most vulnerable are young men, like a 19-year-old boy. If you teach them that the right way to invest is to day trade options, we know there's so much evidence in financial history going back hundreds of years that if you give people the tools to light themselves on fire financially, they will do it. They will ruin their lives if you let them do it. And so I think that's a big element. If there is one silver lining to this, I guess, it's that it's probably better for people to learn the downsides of risk when they're 19 instead of when they're 45 and trying to put their kids through college and have a mortgage to pay for. And so I think if that's the positive part of this is that lots of young people are going to lose a lot of money. That's inevitable. But maybe that will actually set them on a better path once they've burned their hands day trading 0-day options when they were 19. By the time they're 27 and earning a decent salary, they'll say, look, I did it the wrong way before. Let's try to learn how to do it the right way now. And I think that was not the case a generation ago when a lot of 40-year-olds, their first experience in the stock market was day trading.com stocks in 1999, and they lost everything in their 40s. And that is much more catastrophic in your life than figuring out when you're 19.
Yeah.
Yeah, not surprisingly, I agree with Morgan 100% once again, and I think that is a silver lining that if I imagine it's almost impossible to intellectually persuade somebody away from that gambling instinct of getting rich quickly because it's so intoxicating, as Morgan said. So I think maybe you have to let them put their hand on the hot stove and get burned. And better to do it when you're 19 than when you're 49, no question. I I frequently think to myself, can people read what I have to say about market crashes and staying the course and the market will recover and actually be able to do that? Or do they have to live through a market crash, panic, sell, lose their money, and then see it recover without them, which is what I had to go through. I hope they don't have to go through that painful lesson, but there's a side of me that says, they probably do. The other thing
Yeah.
I'd add is when Morgan was talking about these really smart 16-year-olds and they want to focus on getting rich quickly and what a natural instinct that is. I think it's fundamentally part of really smart people in general that when you're really smart, it's hard to believe that you can't do that. It's hard to believe that you can't figure out what hot stock to buy and beat the odds and get rich quickly. It just seems like a smart person like me ought to be able to do that. And the slow building wealth with indexing, that's okay for those kind of slow fogies that don't want to really learn how to pick stocks. But for me, I can learn how to pick stocks. I hear that all the time, JL.
That's so interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
your approach is great for people who don't want to spend the time to learn how to pick stocks. And I'm like, no, no, my approach is the approach that works best for everybody other than Warren Buffett and Peter Lynch, right?
Yeah.
So, but but I think that it's hardest for smart people because, and I'm kind of reflecting my own experience because I was a stock picker for a long time and I was pretty good at it. I achieved financial independence picking stocks. So it doesn't mean that picking stock, it's not like picking stocks doesn't work. It's just much more work and it doesn't work as well as indexing. It
Hmm.
took me a long time to come to that realization because I would think to myself, well, the index buys everything. All I have to do is not buy the bad companies and I can beat the index. Or all I have to do is just buy the good companies and I'm going to beat the index. But that actually statistically doesn't work. And part of it is because today's bad companies are sometimes tomorrow's exciting turnaround stories. And today's high flyers are Enron, as it turns out. And for those
Yeah.
people who don't know, Enron had a spectacular crash in the meltdown in 08, 09. So anyway, yeah.
I'm looking here at some of the questions that have come in, and there is a really common theme, which is that the smart people who are your listeners and watch and viewers here, they are feeling like there's a lot of economic uncertainty out there. They are watching, I'm just looking at these different comments, they are watching the explosion of national debt, the dollar continuing to lose value. And then on the other hand, gold rising. Um, and they're essentially trying to figure out what is the right path. So, JL, I think I have a little bit more already of an idea of what your answer might be. So, but so for surprise factor, I'm going to ask Morgan what when people are saying, okay, like things are going to hell in a handbasket, what do I invest in? What do you say?
Well, I've been an investor for 20 years, not as long as JL has, but also as an amateur student of history to witness how people have responded to that question for the last 100+ years. I would, on one hand, have, of course, empathy for the uncertainty that people are dealing with, or that everyone's dealing with right now, whether it's in war or politics or the economy, whatever it might be. On the other hand, I would say I don't think there's fundamentally more uncertainty now than there has ever been at any point in my life. I think what changes over time is not uncertainty, it's people's perception of uncertainty. And nothing shines the perception of uncertainty more than hindsight. And so it's very easy for us to sit here today and look back at 1 year ago, 20 years ago, and think, oh, the world was so certain back then. We all knew what was going to happen back then. But of course, at the time, we didn't. We know now. And so 10 years ago doesn't seem like that uncertain because we know what happened over the last 10 years. We know how the story ended. But if we went back 10 years ago to 2016 and the three of us were having this conversation, we would say the world is more uncertain today than it's ever been. And so I think just accepting that actually like the most uncertain day in US history, at least in modern times, was September 10th, 2001. But nobody knew it. Nobody knew how uncertain it was at the time. And in fact, if you asked people at the time, they would say, oh, the world's actually very certain right now. It feels pretty great. So I think it's just the perception of certainty that changes over time. And without a doubt, if the three of us hold this talk 10 years from now, we're going to have nostalgia about how certain the world was in 2026. That's always how it's been. And I think it always will be that way. So I think the proper mindset for an investor is wrapping your head around that. It's not more uncertain today than it's ever been. It's just the perception that you don't know how the story is going to end next. And the acceptance of uncertainty and volatility is what you get paid for as an investor. The reason that the stock market does historically better than bonds and cash is because it requires that you put up with and endure uncertainty. That I'm very confident that I'm going to earn a good return over the next 20 years, but I don't know when it's going to come. It might all come next year, and then I'll have 19 flat years. We might have 19 flat years in front of us and then a bonanza in year 20. Like, you don't know when it's going to come. And putting up with that and dealing with that is what you're getting paid for. I think that's the proper mindset.
Yeah, it's that volatility that you're getting paid for because the market rises relentlessly over time, but it's a wild ride and it's very volatile. And because of that, you get paid the outside returns. And again, I agree with everything Morgan said. I would also say that there is never going to be a golden time to invest. I hear people saying, "Well, I'm not going to invest now because of this, that, and this, all these uncertain things that are happening." Well, then you're never going to invest because there's never going to be a point in time where you can't look at the situation and find reasons to worry. There's a saying on Wall Street that the market climbs a wall of worry. I wrote a post back in 2015 called "Time Machine and the Future Returns of Stocks," and the gist of the post was imagine that you're sitting around in 1975, which is the year I happened to start investing, and you are more aware than I was at the time. And you say, hey, there's this guy, Jack Bogle, and he's just starting this company called Vanguard, and he's just created a thing called an index fund. And I'm kind of wondering how's that going to work out over the next 40 years. And in the blog post, I say, well, as a matter of fact, I'm just back from 2015 in my time machine. And I can tell you exactly what happened over those 40 years. And then I go through the litany of all the disasters and wars and market crashes and, that happened because that was a tumultuous 40 years. And of course, everybody around the campfire, man, thanks for telling us, we're never going to invest in stocks at all, let alone this index fund. And of course, the punchline is, well, the index fund returned 12% on average over those 40 terrible years.
Right.
So in 2015, a lot of people, including Jack Bogle and Vanguard, were saying, you're going to have to, investors are simply going to have to expect over the next decade lower returns. You're just going to have to expect the stocks are going to return 4 or 5%. It's not going to be like it's been the last few years. Well, now, of course, we've got that decade under our belt, and it's been pretty damn good. And if you had said in 2015, one of the other things to consider when you think about that 4 or 5% return, by the way, there's going to be a major worldwide pandemic kind of like the one they had back in 1918. It's going to kill a whole bunch of people. It's going to shut not only the US economy down completely, but the world's economy is down completely. So is that in your mix with the 4 or 5%? Well, and I don't know what
Right.
it's returned in the last 10 years, but I think it's north of 12%.
Yeah.
So there you go. The market does remarkably well in bad times. In fact, Ben Carlson, who writes a great column called "A Wealth of Common Sense," just did one. Well, because of the Iranian war that's just started, he just did one about how the market actually performs during times of war. And it turns out it does okay. So there you go.
Yeah. Um, with there is so much noise online, offline, everywhere. I'm really curious, for two people who obviously are experts in this space. What do you pay attention to? Even if you're not paying attention in terms of changing your investing, just what are the sources of expertise that you find interesting?
See, you framed it very well there because I pay attention to everything and I read everything. I follow the market not only every day, but multiple times a day. I love it. I think it's a very interesting window into the world and people's behavior, but it has never influenced how I invest. So even if I wake up early and read all of the headlines in the Wall Street Journal and every economic data point that I can get my hands on, every opinion that I can get my hands on, I'm not making any changes to my investments. I dollar cost average into index funds, and I hope to own them for the next 50 years. And that's where it begins and ends. And so I think there's a difference between trying to stay informed with what the world's going on, with what's happening in the world, being intellectually stimulated with the amazing show that is human behavior and how people respond to risk and entrepreneurism and whatnot, and that information causing you to take action in your portfolio. That's the disconnect where it ends. And so there's very little information that would cause me to make fundamental changes into how I invest. I wouldn't say it's zero, but the bar is extremely high for me to read a headline in the Wall Street Journal and say I need to go out and buy more or sell now. Like theoretically, that's possible, but it hasn't happened so far. And so I think that's it. It's just you should read as much information as you can within the confines of it not influencing how you make decisions, particularly on a short-term basis.
Yeah, so I mean, like you, I read as much as I possibly can, and I tend to follow the market more than I probably should. I wouldn't recommend that people do it, but I do have a certain detachment that I think I can get away with it. Having said that, I have made what I consider a pretty minor change in my investment approach recently, and I just put a post in my blog about this if anybody's interested. But it's for a long time, and this goes back to when I think in 2012 I wrote my post on international investing and why I was not an international investor. But at the same time, when I talk to international audiences, when I'm not talking to Americans, I have always sung a slightly different tune. And that tune, so the tune I've sung to Americans and that I followed myself and taught to my daughter is basically total stock market index fund. My preference is VTSAX, which is Vanguard's version. But when I'm talking to international audiences, I make the point to them that the United States is the only country that is large enough and dominant enough in the economic world where we Americans can get away with investing only in our own country. And if I were living in any other country, I wouldn't be comfortable investing entirely in a different country. And so for those people, I've always said, just go with a world fund. And the world fund I recommend is VT, which is the ETF version of Vanguard's Total World Stock Market Index Fund, which is about 62% US stocks. So still heavily US dominated, but it's the world fund. And that's where I've always recommended everybody who's not an American to go. Having said that, I've also said that the trend I see that has been going on since the end of World War II is when World War II ended, the United States was the only country in the world that wasn't in ashes. And
Mhm.
so the world economy, to a large extent, was the United States. And then through the Marshall Plan and other initiatives, we helped rebuild the rest of the world, which was great for the rest of the world. It was great for the United States. And so what happened is the economic worldwide pie got bigger and bigger. The percentage that the US accounted for got progressively smaller as other countries began to recover and grow. That's a good thing for everybody, including the United States, because our slice might be smaller, but the pie is so much bigger. And I've always said that's a trend that I see continuing. And at some point, as the rest of the world continues to catch up and the increase in wealth, worldwide wealth in my lifetime has just been stunning, not just in this country, but everywhere. There's far less poverty worldwide than there has ever been anyway. So that's a trend I see happening. I have always said to my daughter, it's a trend you want to watch, and at some point you too are going to want to go to a world fund. I think some of the economic policies that are being put in place at the moment are accelerating that trend. And so in my IRAs alone, simply because I could do this without it being a taxable event, I've gone from VTSAX to VT. I've gone into the ETFs just because it's easy to do and they're a little bit cheaper. So I see that as a pretty minor shift in a part of my portfolio. And I've had my wife and my daughter do the same thing.
Mhm.
So that's the only change I've made. Um, but there you go.
And I mean for you that's it's the only change you've made and it's subtle, but for you it's actually not so subtle. I mean, you've been talking about just keep investing in the US market for a long time. And so to begin to for your own self say, actually, I'm going to balance this out in a little different way is interesting.
What's interesting, but I think it's very consistent with what I've been saying all along, because
Yeah.
again, I've way back when I was first wrote the post on international investing, I've always said if you disagree with me, and a lot of people do, and you think that you want to have international, you'll get no pushback from me. I'm not going to say that you're wrong. I don't personally feel a
Mhm.
need for it. I do see a trend that will ultimately make that a wise thing to do, and I
Mhm.
just moved into that trend a little sooner than I would have guessed, but also in a small part of my portfolio. So
Yeah.
I am not even a little bit losing faith in the United States, right? I
I
am
got
still
yeah.
dominantly invested in the United States. And as Warren Buffett once said, it's a mistake to bet against the United States, but I think it's not a bad time to expand your horizons a little bit if you're so inclined. And by the way, if you're not, I've also said in the post, for people who read that and say, well, I still think all US is fine. Like I said before, you're not going to get pushback from me if you add international when I'm not, and you're not going to get pushback from me if you choose not to now.
I think to add to that point, it tends to be true that over a long enough period of time, these things converge upon each other. And
It,
so, yes, you can have a 10-year period where European stocks do better than American stocks do better than Asian stocks, whatever it might be. Over a 20, 30-year period, they're probably going to converge. Over a 40, 50-year period, they'll probably converge, and it won't necessarily matter that much. It's over the shorter periods of time that these things can make a big difference. We went through a 10 or 15-year period where US stocks absolutely trampled international stocks. Over the last 2 or 3 years, international stocks have trampled US stocks. Over a short period of times, you have that. I would not bet, it's possible, but I would not bet that over the next 30 years, there'll be that much different between the two. They'll go through different cycles back and forth, but over time, they'll probably tend to equal each other more or less.
I agree, and I think that balancing, if you will, is one of the things that I see has been happening ever since World War II, becoming more and more aligned, if you will. So the last time that international trounced the U.S. was the first decade of this century, from
Yep.
2000, and they vastly outperformed. And then for the last 15 years, the U.S. has dominated. So it always has been a back and forth kind of thing. But I think, yeah, if you track the performance of VT and VTI, which is the U.S. total stock market over the next 30 years, one will do better than the other. I can't possibly predict which it'll be, but I can tell you with almost certainty the difference will be incremental.
Right.
Yeah. Um, Here's a different question for the two of you. And I'm just curious, as somebody whose my whole job is related to books. You both, like, neither one of you needs to have written books. This isn't you do plenty of things. JL, you've had a whole career. Morgan, you do a lot of speaking. What is why write a book?
Well, I think almost every author will have some experience like this where there is no better exercise in your life to crystallize your gut feelings than writing them down. And a lot of times you will walk around with gut feelings that you think are really true. And it's not until you write them down that one of two things happens. Once you write it down, you either instantly see all the flaws and all the holes, or the opposite. You write it down, you're like, that's what it is. Now I finally really wrap my head around what this is. And so I think writing is a very good exercise for everybody, no matter what their field or industry is, to really crystallize a story inside your own head to try to figure out what it is. I think too. I think there's so much value in in storytelling. And in your head, you walk around again with gut feelings and maybe a couple statistics. It's not until you can really tell a story around it that you can contextualize it within your own life. I think one of the key skills of authors, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, doesn't matter what it is the ability to get the reader to contextualize the book within their own life. To be like, oh, I understand that feeling because I felt it. I can imagine what that would feel like. I've experienced that. I think that's the main point. And it's hard to do that in a conversation or thinking in your own head. It's not until you really write it down that I think there's a tremendous amount of value to it. And so I think even if you're not a professional writer, of course, which the vast majority of people are not, a diary, a personal blog, a personal note to yourself is a very clarifying activity.
Yeah, writing absolutely clarifies your thinking and in ways that I didn't appreciate. I developed my investment approach over decades and made a lot of mistakes along the way. And so when it comes to 2011, which is when I started my blog, in my mind, I was very comfortable with the way I was investing. But now I was faced with wanting to put it down on paper to be available for Jessica because I didn't think she was listening to me. And if I wasn't around, I wanted the information to be there. And to Morgan's point, once I started doing that, it forced me to think about, okay, this is what I do and this is what I believe in investing, but why? I mean,
Mm.
what's my rationale behind that? How do I explain this to my daughter? And by extension, when you put your ideas out in public on a blog or in a book, at least for me, I want to think through those ideas very carefully so that A, I don't make any factual errors, but B, that not everybody's going to agree with me, and that's fine, but that I can defend what I've said. That I
Yeah.
could, I then, and that I've thought about, okay, what are the objections to this approach? What could they possibly be? And I try to run through that exercise saying, okay, for me, what level of validity do those objections hold? How do I respond to them? Maybe I should accept them, and in some cases I have when they've occurred to me or I've come across them. But if I choose not to accept them, what's my rationale for that? And on how solid ground am I standing with that rationale? And I think when you put your ideas down on paper, even for yourself, it forces you to go through that exercise. When you're putting it down for somebody else, initially, in my case, for my daughter, and then also for a wider audience, well, you're going to be challenged. And for your own self-preservation, you better go through that exercise and make sure what you're saying, and you're never going to have everybody agree, but make sure that you feel on solid ground of how you've arrived at those conclusions and what your response to objections would be.
It can be
Well,
a harrowing experience as an author when you sit down to write a chapter, write something, and there's the blinking cursor on the page, and the cursor is saying, "What next? What else you got?" And you realize like you actually don't know as much about this topic as you thought you did. That can be, and I think a lot of nonfiction books, the author starts not as an expert, but as a couple of vague ideas, and the process of writing is what taught them all of those concepts. It's almost never the case that an author begins writing a book knowing everything, knowing all the material that they're about to write. The process of writing is what pulls those ideas out of their head.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. And it's the same corollary. People are fond of saying the best way to learn something is to teach it. And
mm,
the same process, because if you're going to teach something to somebody, you have to have a deep comfort level with that knowledge if you're going to convey it to somebody else. And it's the same thing with writing a book. So you sit down and you say, okay, I'm comfortable with what I believe. Now, what is that exactly? And why exactly am I comfortable with it? And that's, the pulling process that you were just referring to, Morgan.
that's great.
Yeah.
Well, we are just about at time, and we definitely have not gotten to all the questions because there have been so many. If you did ask a question that we didn't get to, we're going to pass it on to JL and to Morgan afterwards and try to get it answered at least in JL's newsletter. Morgan, for people who want more information about you and your books and your other work, where's the best place to direct them?
Well, every decent and not so decent idea that I've ever come up with is in one of those three books that I wrote: The Psychology of Money, Same as Ever, and The Art of Spending Money. That those three really encapsulate everything that I've learned and thought about this topic. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. And JL still has his own blog. There's also the Simple Path newsletter, which, if for anybody who, particularly those who want to see the answers to some of the unanswered questions, the newsletter sign up is at simplepathtowealth.com. And JL, any closing thoughts from you?
Yeah, and the blog is jlcollinsnh.com. And
Yeah.
that's a good way to start if you want to connect with me. And of course, I'm on Facebook and X. The other thing I would say is uh, if anybody listening to us has not read Morgan's work, uh, I think all three of his books are breathtakingly good. They're extraordinarily well written. They're entertaining to read, and educationally, it's just top-notch stuff. So, if for some reason you haven't read them or you haven't read all of them, do yourself a favor.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
Well, thank you, JL. That means a lot coming from you. My wife turned me on to your books before I found you. She was a huge fan, and she's not someone who comes from a financial background or even much of a financial interest, but she instantly clicked to the
Yeah.
simple path of wealth, which I think says a lot. If you can communicate these ideas to people who are not in the finance profession and don't even have that much interest in them to begin with, but you can still get your point across, all the better. And you were one of the first to do it. So thank you.
well, obviously, you married a brilliant woman.
True.
On that note, I really thank you both so much for spending this time with us, and we'll follow up with everybody via the newsletter. Thank you all.